Spec Ops: The Line uses procedural rhetoric in its narrative structure to criticize the heroic and glorified outlook on war which is presented in the storylines of many modern shooter video games. Spec Ops accomplishes this by utilizing common elements of these games in an unconventional fashion. The three primary aspects of the game which are used to achieve this effect are dialogue, binary choices, and loading screen text. It's common for single-player shooter video games to place the player in a squad which talks to and helps guide them through the process. Spec Ops: The Line does this as well and uses the dialogue between its characters to highlight the dissonance between upbeat dialogue and dire circumstances which are present in other games in the genre. A strategy used by the developers early on is to keep dialogue comedic and tonally light to draw comparisons to other shooters and make the player feel comfortable. The banter between the squad members will feel familiar to anyone who has played a shooter campaign in the last few decades.
No, sir. Then take it up the chain, Sergeant. Roger that. Lieutenant Adams.
I hear you, Sergeant. What's your status?
Status is chafed, sir.
You say chafe, Sergeant?
Yes, sir. A local airborne insurgency has infiltrated the U.S. zone designated as my pants. Sir.
Shut up, jackass.
Towards the end of Spec Ops, as the characters are faced with more stressful events, their dialogue towards each other becomes angrier and more weary. While it is common for shooter narratives to place characters under difficult circumstances, Spec Ops: The Line never allows its characters a moment to rest, and they do not return to the comedic dialogue at the beginning for the remainder of the game.
People died back there. Not just soldiers and civilians, but Gould. Our best chance of getting out of this hellhole.
Calm down, Lugo. There's nothing we could have done.
Don't tell me to calm down. We got no idea what the fuck we're doing here.
Yeah, you're right. Putting your faith in Gould, you are fucking clueless. Man, I'm through with this shit.
Fuck you! At least I'm doing my job. You're the one who's fine, just sitting back, waiting for things to unfuck themselves. You think I like watching these people?
This is in stark contrast to similar shooter games where characters have light banter and dialogue throughout the entirety of their narratives. Spec Ops makes it very clear that the war takes its toll on its characters and that it is not something which should be taken lightly. The fact that the squad mates in Spec Ops: The Line make the transition out of witty dialogue and never return both highlights and criticizes the glorification of war in other games in the genre. Another shooter trope that Spec Ops: The Line turns on its head is the implementation of binary choices. In several games in the genre, players are at some point forced to decide between saving one of two people. These choices typically serve to give the player more agency in the narrative of the game and empower them by offering a simple decision based on which character they feel more connected to. In Spec Ops: The Line, the binary choices appear this way at first, but quickly make way for intense and morally gray ethical dilemmas which the player is thrust in the middle of. In addition to increasing player agency in the storyline like other shooters, the decisions a player must make in Spec Ops force them to consider each option in the context of the broader, war-torn game world. While other games might have players decide which of their squad members to keep alive, Spec Ops: The Line pressures them to choose between which of two strangers committed the most terrible crime and execute them on the spot. Binary choices like this, with no positive outcomes, leaves the player with a sense of powerlessness, which is more reminiscent of the difficult decisions of real war than choices in other video games. As such, how Spec Ops: The Line uses binary choices in a serious and realistic fashion undermines the heroic and optimistic nature of the choices present in other modern shooter games. Like many shooter games, Spec Ops: The Line features loading screens which are supplemented with text for the player to read while waiting for loading to complete. What Spec Ops does differently, however, is how it chooses to use these screens to address the player. Most of the time, loading screen text provides helpful advice for the player under the assumption that they have recently died and are restarting. In shooter games, this amounts to tips which can assist the player in killing enemies more efficiently to beat the level they are on. In the beginning, Spec Ops: The Line offers many samples of loading screen text in this vein. As the game progresses, the loading screens become much more cryptic, dealing with the anti-war themes present in the game and even addressing the player directly. This subtle transition lulls the player into thinking Spec Ops as a typical shooter before it begins to pull back the curtain and makes them question what they are doing in the game. By using these transition screens to criticize the player, while they are utilized in other shooter games to help them, Spec Ops: The Line clearly denounces the indifference to violence which is shown in those games. Through its unorthodox use of dialogue, binary choices, and loading screen text, Spec Ops: The Line draws attention to how commonly these systems are used in modern shooter video games to present war in a good light. By employing these design elements, which it shares with other games in the genre, against them, Spec Ops: The Line offers an indictment of the narratives of modern shooter video games for glorifying war through the eyes of the player character.